So my name is Sean Grant. I'm an assistant professor in social and behavioral science at the Indiana University Richard M. Fairbanks School of Public Health. My talk is on transparency in the research lifecycle, subtitled The RT2 Roadmap for an Open and Reproducible Research Workflow and Scientific Ecosystem. So apologies to those in the back row on the right who I can't kind of see. I wish I could move the podium, but I can't. I'll at least try and get over there for the Q&A, but I've been told this is the best for the camera, and I want to help out our guys over here working hard all day. So I'm going to stay put for the slides and then go over there for the Q&A. A little about myself. We've been told that, we're human beings, so introduce ourselves. So my background, I'm an applied methodologist, particularly intervention research methods. I work across behavioral, social, and health sciences, and overall, the work that I do is in the aspiration to advance the credibility of intervention research and then its utility for supporting evidence-based policy and practice. I put a few of my open science transparency related projects up on the board. If anybody wants to chat, I'll be here the whole week. So Consort SPY, which I think was in your reading packet, is a formal extension of the Consort guidelines for reporting randomized trials of behavioral and social and economic interventions. The Trust Initiative that I've launched with Evan Mayo Wilson at the Bloomington School of Public Health at Indiana is about increasing transparency in the social behavioral intervention research space. I've worked with the GRADE group, which is the group that underlies the development of practice guidelines like WHO guidelines on how we rate confidence in bodies of evidence on more complex interventions. And then I've done some work on transparency of expert panels, particularly Delphi processes and pre-registering those. So if any of those are your jam, happy to chat. Otherwise, maybe that gives you just a bit of background of the perspective I'm going to take on this. Personally, though I live in Indiana, I'm from LA originally. I went to grad school in the UK. So if you're wondering, I don't hear any Midwest nice. I hear British idioms, SoCal slang, and I have a proclivity to curse once or twice in my presentations. That's why. So the point of this presentation, which usually comes before TEDS, but with scheduling we're doing it now, is really to provide a conceptual framework for the whole training. The first year or two we didn't have this and realized folks were walking away not really sure how everything fit together, the coherence of all of the sessions. So we developed that roadmap figure that you'll see in all of the presentations going forward. And then this presentation, it just kind of lets you know, here's how we approach designing this whole week and what our goals of the week are for you. And so in sum, we want you to see all of these sessions as practices and tools that fit together for two major purposes. One, for you to try and normalize transparent and reproducible workflows in your own work. But then secondly, we are now officially anointed, if you aren't already, as BITS catalysts. So to be a catalyst toward an open scientific ecosystem. So moving your fields, your colleagues, your stakeholders, your areas towards transparent and reproducible science. So I just got here for Ted's last talk. Have you seen this yet, or is this the first time you're seeing this today? Sorry? First time? Okay, cool. So you will see this slide. You saw it 3 times. Okay. So this is the map again. And the goal, as I mentioned, of this training course is to try and create an open scientific ecosystem or scientific enterprise that's open by design. So our hope is that this roadmap will help you take stock of what you learn over the next couple days to normalize these practices and tools as part of each of your own studies and projects moving forward, to disseminate and implement these practices and tools in your respective fields. So thinking about what would this look like in my area if it's not there already. And then lastly, some of the things that have come out of previous sessions and BITS events are identifying gaps or blind spots to the movement towards open science. So hopefully this is new, even though you've seen this for the 4th time now. We're not saying that this is it, right? These are the things so far that of all the work we've done and the work that colleagues in this area have done that we think are sort of the minimum essential parts of a transparent and reproducible workflow. You might say, oh my God, there is this glaring omission. Run with it and let us support you. So just to give a background to how I approach this, like I mentioned, I'm a public health scientist. I think in terms of social and behavioral determinants of health problems. So I kind of think of the open science movement as an intervention movement to address a problem. And that main problem that we have are these things at the center of the roadmap. Most notably, the thing that's really given this a lot of traction the last 10 years is that we have a reproducibility and a replicability problem. And so I run with the definition of reproducibility more so as computational reproducibility, using the same method, same data, finding the same results, and then replication as trying to implement a methodological protocol with a new sample. And so here's just a list of papers, if you're not familiar with some or all of these, that you can check out on your own, that basically indicate that key findings in core social and behavioral disciplines tend to not have as much success replicating results as we might hope. Now, that doesn't mean that the first initial finding was a false positive, but there has been concern that one of the reasons why these rates are lower than we would have expected before doing these wide-scale studies is that the original findings are in fact false positives. So that leads me as a behavioral and social scientist and public health to ask, okay, I've identified my problem, why does that problem exist? And so to oversimplify, the social determinant of the problem in my eyes, and you see this a lot in the meta-scientific community, is the scientific ecosystem itself. So let me know if this resonates with anybody. You are trying to get your study in the Journal of Sexy Stories. Publishing in the Journal of Sexy Stories gets you funding from sponsors. Even if as sponsors are changing their policies, we still have reviewers who work for these sponsors who look at CVs, they look at the places that you publish and say, oh, so-and-so has published in the Journal of Sexy Stories. That must mean they're a prestigious researcher who knows their shit. There's the cursing. So we want to give them more money. And then you work in a research institution that facilitates this publish or perish funding or famine paradigm, and we have this vicious cycle that repeats itself. So this social determinant, this current status quo of the scientific ecosystem, leads scientists to respond in particular ways. Scientists are people. My particular take on this is scientists aren't the genius of the society. We live in a culture and we live in a work culture that is supposed to facilitate rigorous processes, and so the outputs of that are what make us trust scientists. I know plenty of brilliant people who don't work in science as well as within, so it's us responding to our environment. That environment is supposed to reinforce what's best for research, and that should be high quality studies regardless of the outcomes that you found. But in actuality, a lot of the times what's best for researchers as human beings who have a mortgage to pay, bills to pay, mouths to feed, lights to keep running, indirects to collect for their institution, is publishing lots of publishable results. So there's a kind of a disconnect. I think the Venn diagram maybe overlaps a little bit more than this overly dramatic, completely separate circles, but there isn't a great overlap there, and that's one of the things that has motivated this entire movement, spawning things like BITS and the BITS RT2. And then this social ecosystem then leads to behavioral determinants of limited replicability, and we're really focusing in now on the things that you'll learn about in the next session, and that's what are called questionable or sometimes detrimental research practices. So while there might be, before I get into these practices, of course, things like scientific misconduct, fabrication, falsification of your data, plagiarism, those are just bad no-nos that if we find those, we got to get rid of them. But then there's this gray area of practices that are acceptable within a discipline. You don't get punished for them. If not, you get selected on them, that at the end of the day lead us to be in the red circle, not the green circle. And these are things that we want to change. So some examples of these are under-specified protocols. Your methods and analytic plan aren't shared with other scientists in sufficient detail, if at all. So you can't even reproduce the procedures that are supposed to produce the results, let alone the results themselves. Reporting bias, so this could be scientists that dueling authors pistols that Ted was talking about, and or journals deciding not to submit studies to a journal, that would be the authors, or journals deciding not to publish certain analyses, outcomes, or even entire studies. And the most common reason might be, I couldn't even p-hack this to a less than 0.05. The Journal of Sexy Stories isn't going to think this is a sexy story, so I'm not going to submit it. Or the journal says, this story isn't sexy enough for us. We appreciate this should go somewhere, but not here. Data dredging, p-hacking, data mining, whatever term you're used to hearing this as, repeatedly searching a data set, trying all different analyses or specifications of your model until a particular result is found, usually a significant result. And then human error, just technical errors that may exist within a study, computational errors, Copy-paste mistakes. I just saw this morning on the way in, someone retweeting a study from a few years ago saying that potentially up to 1 in 5 genetic studies are wrong because people were doing them in Excel, and there's a particular gene that Excel reads as a date, September 2nd, right? And so it's just using that program could lead to wrong data. If you're not sharing your data, you're not sharing your procedures, no one's going to check that, and then that goes in the literature. And I think a really important thing that I like to emphasize here is I'm not saying this in any kind of judgmental way on the human beings. A lot of the times this isn't a conscious, malicious thing. You're just doing what's normative in your area or what you learned in your squireship, your PhD, from your mentor on how to do this stuff, and it just carries on. But at the end of the day, collectively as a system, these practices are questionable and are detrimental to the quality and confidence, certainty of the evidence that we have in our bodies of literature. These behaviors span the entire life cycle of a research study and project. So these aren't things that happen just at the very end. It is from the word go, from even posing the questions for your research study, let alone starting to think about the design of it. That's one thing we want to emphasize is this is about your entire workflow, the entire life cycle of a research study or project. And each of these problems at each of these stages of the life cycle can lead to considerable waste. For those who aren't familiar, The Lancet had a reward campaign that talked about increasing the value and reducing waste of biomedical research that I think is just an excellent read, even if you're not in the area. And one of the things that they did was tabulate across the main stages of the research life cycle potential sources of waste, like posing irrelevant questions, not using the appropriate research design, inefficient regulation and management of your research, not having accessible and full research reports, or even when you do have a report that's biased, and that is unusable. So at the end of the day, there's estimates that potentially up to 85% of biomedical research is subject to one, if not all of these sources of waste. And then that harms what I think everybody in this room wants to do, which is use science to improve society and people's well-being. So there really is a direct utilitarian line or argument to this. But then from a more idealistic point of view, these questionable research practices are counter to the ideal normative behavior that Ted went through this morning. So instead of having these norms that we should be following, we have these counter norms that kind of are the status quo, and that's what this movement is trying to correct. Assume you saw this earlier as well, so I'll move on. Cool. What enables these behaviors beyond the scientific ecosystem having these norms that are kind of harmful? And this is where, amongst the many things that are happening in science, beyond just open science is but one solution. But open science is the purported solution or movement that's trying to solve one factor facilitating limited credibility of science, and that are closed workflows. So this might seem familiar to you. This is from an article in Nature that was specifically focusing on p-values, but I think it speaks to the whole framework that we use. And it's that we put most scrutiny in terms of the norms or status quos in most of our fields on the final paper, on the thing that's reported in that 3,000-word advertisement for your analyses of your data set, when there's all of this stuff that happens before that we need to have more debate on, that new technologies living in the digital age actually give us the ability to do that. So when you hear about things like declarative design in a bit, we have these technologies to open up that first stage of experimental design, have some debate at an early stage, like a stage 1 registered report, so that we have appropriate scrutiny across the whole workflow, and you're beginning with that end in mind. So, as a solution, open science is really about, at least here, transparent and reproducible workflows. There are a lot of things that fall under the banner of open science and open scholarship. This training course specifically focuses on research workflows. So these are the top standards. You might be familiar with the Transparency and Openness Promotion Guidelines. They're standards that are for journals that they can take on board. It's modular, so they can pick one or more of these to incorporate into their policies and procedures, and then identify what level they want to implement them. Encourage, require, and then actually use resources to verify that these things have been done. But these have kind of become what I would refer to as the core outcome set, or the core set of practices in the open science movement. Pre-registering your stuff, sharing your stuff, citing things beyond just papers, and then with an eye towards replication and bodies of evidence rather than single studies that lead to a situation where this week we can eat chocolate because it's good for us, next week we can't eat chocolate because it's bad for us, on, and living in confusion as to whether I'm allowed to enjoy my chocolate. So in terms of this training course, our primary goal is really to develop your capacity to achieve the top standards. So we think about workflows now as an organized workflow that uses file management and really project management software like the Open Science Framework. And while this is a bit of a linear model, and that's a simplification of how things go in the real world, it's a bit more iterative than this. I still find these linear models useful as a starting point to understand this space. We're thinking about key decisions at the design stage, key decisions when we're conducting our study, key decisions when we're disseminating our results and products of our study, and then the last stage, the if I got hit by a bus stage, making sure that all of my stuff is archived somewhere that someone else can understand so that when you're ready to move on to your next project, it's not in some incomprehensible format on your laptop, but it's out there for others to use with the appropriate ethical and legal protections in place. And it's purposeful that we've chosen these particular things to focus on this week because they address those sources of waste at each stage of the research lifecycle that I mentioned earlier. So focusing on a body of evidence with things like replications and meta-analysis helps us pose the best question for the next study. Using pre-registration, pre-analysis plans, power planning helps us to use the appropriate research design methods, conduct analysis, etc. Using organized workflows and file management, version control helps us out with more efficient research regulation and management. Having open and archived materials, data, and code makes sure that we have accessible full outputs on our research. And then things like improved disclosures or reporting guidelines, and then preprints and open access mechanisms for disseminating our reports make sure that our reports are usable and they're out there for the world. At the end of the day, we're empowering you, or hopefully building your capacity to implement these things in your workflow so that the system looks like this by design. We have those key things at each of those stages, and those problems in the middle are gone. So while, again, we're saying for you to think about your own capacity, I'll get to this in a few minutes, also think about yourself as a catalyst for pushing the open science movement in your field. In terms of the rest of this week, questions that I have found helpful in asking myself in each session, as someone who's been even going to this and teaching on this for a few years, we get new people coming in, new developments in this movement. The main things I've found myself asking at a minimum are, what's the nature or purpose of this practice or tool? Right? So we're all critical scholars. Be critical of the things we're presenting, right? See, why should I do this? Why should I invest my time? Why should I invest my resources? What's the point of this thing? If I'm sold, when do I use it? At which stage do I at least need to start thinking about it? And at which stage am I really investing my time and my resources into implementing it? And then how do I use it in my area of research? You might be hearing about a tool that's in an area different than yours. So thinking about what are the core elements of that practice or tool that apply regardless of research area, and then how might I need to adapt that for my own field? So for that first question, I find this template helpful for understanding the nature or purpose of a practice or tool. Is anyone familiar with Tidier, the template for intervention, description, and replication? No? Yes, or some nods? All right, I like you guys. So I like all of you, but that makes me happy. So I'm a big reporting guidelines person, right? Consort is another one of these reporting guidelines or templates. And Tidier is basically your journalist's 6 W's for an intervention, right? Any purposeful thing where you're trying to change something in order to improve the state of affairs. And they provide this generic template when you're trying to describe an intervention, which I see these practices as. Who are the people involved? What materials and procedures are involved? When do you do it? Where do you do it? What's the rationale? What's the mode and format of using it, and what's the intensity of using it? So, capitalizing on the fact that we switched these presentations around, if you're using this in TEDS, you might say, okay, he talks a lot about pre-registration. This is something that's done by the research team or lead investigator for other interested stakeholders. Ideally, I'm using some kind of standardized item, template, or tool like Declare Design that gives me the information I need to include to describe my study background, my objectives, my methods, my analysis plan. When do I do it? Ideally, prior to the recruitment of your first participant if you're doing a prospective study. It gets a little bit more tricky if you're using secondary data and or qualitative data that doesn't follow the experimental hypothetical deductive method. But it's supposed to be before you're able to lie and say, oh, I haven't looked at this, and aren't I so smart for guessing everything perfectly before I dug into this? Where, as Ted mentioned, publicly accessible databases, and I think a key descriptor to add to that are independently controlled, right? So you could have a personal website that's publicly accessible, but you could change the Google Doc on there, submit it somewhere where you can say, once I sent this there, I have no control over the version, I have no control over the content on this, and that gives someone that much more trust, credibility of your output. Why do you do this? You have an audit trail for reviewers. It gives your confirmatory analyses that much more credibility that they weren't p-hacked. And another thing is it's kind of an advertisement tool. If it's not something that you think you need to embargo, if you're not worried about scooping, it makes interested stakeholders aware. Not sure if folks are familiar, but the original reason for clinicaltrials.gov was not to pre-register methods, it was to recruit patients. That's still a primary reason. It's to make patients aware of an ongoing study that they can enroll on. And then the research community said, hey, we can sort of co-opt this and build on this and use it for this methodological purpose as well. You submit this online typically, an individual team member is the one who makes that happen. Do it at least once for every study at that point, particularly if you're doing some kind of trial before you recruit someone, but then you can version it. You can update it over time, and a lot of these platforms like clinicaltrials.gov or OSF have version control. So you can see the trail of the changes you've made at the exact point in time because it's time-stamped. And then at the end of the day, you're not going to fool yourself. And I think everyone here, if you're interested in this stuff, you really do care about the credibility of your work. And we're the easiest people to fill. We're the easiest people to look at analysis 6 months later and say, yeah, I think I wanted to do that all along. But then you go back 6 months before and say, oh, you know what, crap, I changed my mind 3 months ago for this very good reason. It's a useful self-check, not just auditing for those outside of your team, but within your team as well. So that's an example if you find that helpful or tools like this. I've used this to take notes during sessions. In terms of when to use research practices or tools, this is why we have the roadmap. So really thinking about, as well Ted said, it's iterative. All of these things are relevant at pretty much all stages. You want to begin with the end in mind. It's thinking about, in particular, when you're going to have to spend the most time investing your time and financial resources to implement these practices. But doing this at the beginning of your study, making sure you allow yourself enough time. And I think a really important thing that's really, I've appreciated more now than I did when I started this, is budgeting for it, particularly if it's your first time doing this. And if you're writing a grant proposal, budgeting for this in your grant proposal and justifying it, particularly if it's a funder like the NIH or PCORI, who have these policies now saying you need to do some of these things, like share your data and say, okay, well then compensate me. So I think that's a really important thing to think about, that when, in terms of when are you investing your time and your financial resources for your project. An example of doing this, the Center for Open Science, who developed the Open Science Framework, which we talk about a lot because it's open source and it's free to use. They have this example figure where they've looked at all of the stages in a research life cycle, and then they show you which other programs interact with the OSF, which are interoperable with the OSF. So we're not saying it's OSF or nothing, only use our thing. If you're using GitHub, if you're using Dropbox, if you're using Zotero or Mendeley, those can work with the OSF, and they tell you at which stages it might be relevant to start thinking about using these other digital tools. So there's an example of what I'm talking about there. So hopefully that makes a bit more sense. And then lastly, I was talking about how might I adapt these things to my research area. So in my area, there are a lot of taxonomies and conceptual frameworks that you can use to help you make sense of your conceptual or substantive space. And so I tend to use these when I'm thinking about open science, particularly my studies that are on open science practices or developing open science tools, when I'm trying to identify those gaps. These kinds of frameworks are really helpful to me. So one such framework, this is for those who work in translational science and the biomedical sciences. It was developed by one of our CTSIs. This is the program with the NIH that does clinical translational science. And they talk about all of these different stages of comparative effectiveness research, like prioritizing evidence, generating evidence, synthesizing evidence, all the way down to applying it, getting feedback from your health systems, and then that feeding back into that first box. So I tend to focus a lot on original trials and experiments, the initial trial, and tools for doing those kinds of trials, and then replications and meta-analyses. More specifically, in my case, meta-analysis, but I know some of you are interested in replications. So these are the two stages where I'm like, okay, at these stages, what tools should I use? What tools are needed? And even within just these two different stages of my area, we have different registries. Trials would be clinicaltrials.gov. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses go to Prospero. Reporting guidelines, trials use Consort. Systematic reviews use Prisma. Different tools for the workflow. Original trials, you might use something like Declare Design or the OSF. For meta-analyses, there are bespoke tools like EpiReviewer, Distiller SR, SRDR are the tools that folks tend to use for managing their workflows. So same overall practice and concept, open science practice, but in my area, for the type of study I'm doing, the exact kind of tool needs to be adapted. And so this might be something as you walk away from this saying, oh, that thing that I learned halfway through day 2 was super useful to me as someone who's super interested in this. But if I don't translate the language in this or adapt the standards to the things in my field, no one else is going to take this up, and we need people to take this up. Be the person who creates it, who extends an existing guideline or extends an existing tool to your area. It's what a lot of the activity in this work's about, and for those of you who are new to this, it's a great way to get your foot in the door and to get things rolling. So ending the talk, as I mentioned, it's not just about your own workflows, but RT2, as bringing you into the BITS Catalyst community, right? We're catalysts for change in the social and scientific ecosystem. We're about changing that ecosystem. Right now, as I mentioned, science is always embedded within a system of social structures and institutions. Science is made up of institutions that are made up of people. The current norms and behaviors of that system reinforce the closed workflows that lead to the questionable research practices that lead to threats to the credibility of our bodies of evidence. And it does that through those perverse incentives I mentioned. A great quote that I love is, all systems are designed to achieve precisely the results they get, whether they mean to or not. So there's something about the system we need to change. We're all about aspiring for the ecosystem to reinforce those Mertornian norms or those Mertornian ideals. The way we operationalize this, so it's not just hot air, but something concrete, is focusing on these best practices, these tools, these open science behaviors that folks can adopt to achieve transparent, open, and reproducible research. So I was just joking with Ted. I've used this slide for like 3 or 4 years. I think there's a chance that this is the last time I'm going to feel comfortable referring to people as early adopters. I really feel like we're at an inflection point. So he said, if anyone's interested, they're thinking about making stickers that say, I was into bits or I was into open science before open science was cool. So you're probably the last group who could do that without lying or saying, I've always loved Radiohead. So all this to say, we really do think of this as a diffusion effort. This is the diffusion of innovation scale is what this is based off of. And I think we're just about to get into that early majority stage. But help us get others to join, help us to move things along. So there are those billionaires turning up to meta-science like they are at Burning Man now. And that this is just how science is done. There's no more open science. It's just science. The way that I think about this as an intervention researcher is conceptualizing the dissemination and implementation and creation of these practices and tools as interventions. So if you work on economic interventions, right, you have your own frameworks for how do we get things to change, leveraging economic levers, changing behaviors, changing society. Whatever your tools are in your discipline that are about changing things, apply them to this and bring a unique perspective to the open science movement. So for me, that's thinking about these tools and practices as products, practices, programs, policies, whatever your P word is. That's your action in blue. Orange is the mechanism of your action, right? And it's typically targeting the knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors of researchers and other stakeholders in the research system who influence researcher behaviors to ultimately, in green, achieve your outcome, making research more transparent, open, and reproducible. And as I said in my tagline at the beginning, I see myself as trying to advance the integrity, credibility, and utility of research. I'm not saying that I'm successful in doing that, but it's something that makes me feel okay waking up every morning. And I think that's what we're trying to do in this movement. If you want to join, that would be awesome. A few pointers as someone who's been doing this for a little bit that have been really helpful to me and other of my colleagues who do this. So one, think about the roles that each stakeholder in your area can play. I know this is too tiny to see now, but when you pull up the slides, this is from the PRISMA statement for protocol. So PRISMA is preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So if you're ever writing a systematic review or meta-analysis paper, this would be the checklist that you would use to develop your paper. This is the version for protocols. So at the stage before you start actually extracting your data, if not searching for studies. And the folks at the Equator Network, which is sort of the library of reporting guidelines in health research, have started including these tables in all of their papers where they say, okay, we started doing this, if we build it, they will come, but it's not the field of dreams. Authors themselves don't even use these things. So we need to think about all the other stakeholders who interact with researchers at certain points of their workflow and get them to care about these. So what do we want funders to do with this checklist? What do we want guideline developers, since reviews are used a lot to develop practice guidelines? What do we want journal editors and reviewers to do? And I think a key one, particularly for those of you who are earlier on in your career, is thinking of yourself as an educator, or at least as a peer to other early career researchers, postdocs, graduate students. As an educator or as someone who can share new information, what can you do with this to, at least in your local environment, if you can't force people to do it, be that positive, energetic force of change, be that program champion in your setting. So whoever your stakeholders are, think about not just the researcher, but others in your space who can get researchers to adopt these workflows. And then another tip just from behavioral science, for those of you particularly are familiar with behavioral economics, behavioral insights teams, they have these really great mnemonics, these easy ways to remember the things that you should do when you're trying to nudge behaviors. And one of my favorites is the ESEA Framework. Basically, make these things as easy, attractive, social, and timely for your stakeholders in your area. So if you're thinking about registration and you are a graduate student, can you develop some resources for your fellow graduate students at the time where they're developing their protocol for, in the UK, we have an initial Viva where we have to go through this stuff with 2 internal examiners. I know in the UK, in the US, they have, after your quals, you have to propose your research idea. Can you prepare resources that are easy to use? You're building this community where it's a norm in your grad program, and you're giving it to people at the exact time that they need it. It's just one example of using this framework to think about not only building something, but making it something that folks will actually want to use. So in sum, and then happy to have a chat. Actually, I think we have a solid amount of time before lunch if you want to use it, or if you want to do the networking, which is always the best part of these meetings. I will take no offense if you don't want to chat. But I just want to remind you that this training course is about changing your workflow and the more distal goal of the scientific ecosystem at large. So the questions to ask yourself for your workflow, each session: what is the purpose of this thing I'm learning about? When should I use it? How do I apply it? How can I get this taken up in my area of research? Questions for your area: what are the best ways to disseminate and implement a practice or tool in your respective field? Who are the key stakeholders who you should involve or engage in this kind of dissemination implementation effort? And then are there gaps that need new practices or tools? If not, at the very least, an adaptation of an existing practice or tool for your area, but possibly just a tool doesn't exist that needs to exist, or a guideline or a standard. So with that, here's my contact details. I saw that there were some folks who were saying that they were excited on Twitter to be here. I'm excited that you're excited and you're tweeting about it, so would love to engage with you on there. But if you'd rather hit me up via email or just check out some other work and have a chat, I'm here the whole week and I love talking about this stuff. So appreciate your time. I'll now try and pivot over here. Cool beans. I'm in a band, so I know the whole AV stuff. You guys are the real heroes here today. So I'll pivot over here so I can see some folks on this side. Happy to facilitate a conversation if there isn't questions, if you guys want to chat with each other. It's a great group. So thanks for your time. Questions or comments? Hey, everyone.
Thanks a lot. That was a really great presentation. I guess 2 things that I guess, two what I feel like are countervailing forces, at least at my institution, and maybe it's more, I'm in biomedical research.
Yeah, can I, real quick, if
yes.
folks don't mind, it's cool if you do, but I think it would be helpful because we have pretty diverse groups here in terms of stage and area. If you don't mind, at least the first time you chat, saying who you are and what your background is and position.
Yeah. My name's Sam Harper. I'm this Sam H. We have another Sam who happens to be right here. I'm a professor at McGill University in the Department of Epidemiology there. And so I feel like two things. One is about trying to implement this in, at least in a lot of my work, it's collaborative work, and there are collaborators who don't necessarily have not signed on, let's say, to this particular kind of worldview. So that's one issue, is trying to think about how to engage. And this is like maybe for the future, but having a session about how to do this work in a collaborative team environment would be super useful. I guess the other thing I wanted to ask about too was, this is just my personal thing. A lot of the problems we have in our department with people reinforcing non-Mertonian norms come from senior faculty members exerting pressure on graduate students. And I want to know if, I'd like to hear experiences of people who have had success in trying to sort of rebut that or to work and get those people on board. It's not really a question, sorry.
Yeah.
My name is Liz Bajent. I'm at Cornell, and I am a research support specialist, which tells you nothing. I'm sort of between a postdoc and a professor in a role that no one else has. But I do a mix of research and management of research. So I think that there are two challenges with integrating this into research collaborations. One is a technical challenge. What tools are people using? What tools are people comfortable with? How much do they value learning new things? What's their capacity to learn new things? And then there's this other issue that you have brought up, which has to do with attitudes. And so I think that learning more from each other about how to tackle, in particular, well, I guess both of them. The second one, to be honest, my approach and with my peers is to just not work with those people. But I don't think that's the practical thing based on the constraints that we face. But it would be nice to have ideas for something a little more constructive. That's all. I have no answers.
Yeah, so I'm not sure there are answers. I mean, my personal opinion and pragmatic advice is make change where you can, when you can. So it's the sweet spots tend to be in those zones of proximal development. The levers that you can pull or move that have the most impact. So things that are modifiable but impactful. And then in a less kind of like linear, direct way, coalition building with whatever kind of coalition you can form. So I don't know if I'm allowed to say this publicly, but Open Science, because we haven't decided on the name, but where I've been here for a year, and we're starting what I like to refer to as the Open Science Cabal, but I think we're calling it the IUPUI Open Scholarship Coalition. And it's a bunch of folks in the library, which if you work at a university, they are your number one people to help you out with all this stuff. Like, a library is not just a place where you look up a book number in a Dewey Decimal System. These are the people who are pushing this. And then they know people in each of the other departments that I don't know, because those folks engage with them. And the more that you get that building or can interact with folks who exert influence on those obstinate folks in your area is another way to go. I'm not sure research support specialist, if that's like a researcher position helping, or if you're in some of the other like research compliance offices at the university, but like IRBs, intellectual property offices, research integrity. If you have a clinicaltrials.gov office, where now there's really this pressure to make sure those things are registered on time and results reported, because institutions can get fined tens of thousands of dollars a day if they're not, even though that's not happening, they could. That's another advocate who is a human being who, like all of us, is overworked and asked to do too much stuff, that if you're someone who's like, can we join forces? I'll make your life easier and then you can scratch my back. At the very least, it sustains me to keep going as opposed to just giving up hope on this stuff. And then I guess I'll say each other. Like, when I say your catalyst, it's not just a hierarchical structure, like contact the bits group and then we'll get in touch with you. Like network with each other. You've got just people now who you know care about this. We want to facilitate like highly dense, perfectly connected networks, not top-down organizational charts. So use each other as just a source of support in venting, especially because I might know who you're complaining about, but folks who aren't in the health science world at all, which is like, that name means nothing to me, so vent away.
Maybe another comment about cultural change and getting people to kind of change their perspectives. I don't know if anyone here teaches undergrads, but trying to start people out as young as possible, I think, can be super helpful in making the transition. Maybe not even have to transition, it just becomes part of workflow. We have a few catalysts who have developed AP psychology coursework. Maybe, I don't know, I don't think that's necessarily too young to start talking about open science. We teach people how to do science in high school anyway, but yeah, get them while they're young.
Yeah, someone who went to Catholic school from kindergarten to senior year of college, indoctrinate the young is a pretty effective strategy.
I guess I was not sure if this is the best time to ask about it, but I was thinking about pre-registration plans and how well they're followed and what needs to be done by journals or reviewers, I guess, to make sure that people don't just register and then do something different from what they registered. And just curious what thoughts are on that.
And who are you, Megan?
Megan McVeigh at University of Florida in health behavior.
So I'd be keen to hear if anyone else has experience with this, but this is what the registered reports format that Ted was talking about is really supposed to address. So he mentioned that clinicaltrials.gov has existed for a while as a registration mechanism, and it has to be done in clinical medicine, but it's not. Even there, where that's existed and it's a norm, there are tons of empirical studies evaluating how things aren't registered on time, reported on time, reported comprehensively. So this registered reports format tries to build on that by combining it in with the peer review process. And there are even some new initiatives out now that are trying to coordinate that with the funders and the IRBs so that someone's not getting 3 different sets of incoherent advice and potentially even contradictory advice. And they got to figure out, okay, who do I go to first? And then I go back. Those are rare. And while the Center for Open Science's Registered Reports Committee, which I'm on as a COI, I guess, or at least declaration of interest, has a lot of great resources on this. And the head of it, Chris Chambers, actually published a paper today in Nature taking stock of registered reports that might be interesting to read. So a lot of the pragmatic, what are the barriers you might face are on there. I think at the end of the day, you won't get around that it just takes more time and effort. Like it just does to do this. A thought that I oscillate on from probably a weekly basis, not a day-to-day basis, but generally tend to favor is maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we need to slow this train down a little bit. Like maybe we do need to do science slower and we do need these things, but making that happen is tough. So not knowing what influence each of you has over what spheres you have influence over, but if you're on a journal editorial board or have a supervisor who's copacetic with this stuff, bring up registered reports to them if it's not on there. Maybe it's something you can do as part of master's or PhD programs in your area and something to bring up to a committee, something that you get on your CV as something that you accomplished while in grad school that will look good to the faculty who are increasingly selecting on adoption and promotion of transparent and reproducible research. And there was one more group. I don't know if there are any funders in the room, but talk about doing this at least for your prospective trial experimental-esque research that you fund. So just, I leave it open to you to be creative about where you might be able to do that kind of influence, but those are the things I'm aware of. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts, reactions, examples?
Joseph is Wharton University of Pennsylvania. So me and my collaborators have started a website that Ted referred to. We started a website that Ted referred to called aspredicted.org, and that's a website, the tagline is pre-registration made easy. And it's made easy on two fronts. So the first front is it's easy to do. You just answer 9 questions, very simple. All exploratory stuff shouldn't even be in there because the whole point is it distinguishes between them. But the other thing it makes it, the other way it makes it easy is it makes it easy to read and evaluate because you are answering 9 questions in order. It produces a 1 to 2 page PDF document that then during the review process, which you can share with reviewers blind, right? You can create a blind copy. The reviewers they know where to look for the information. They know question 5 is where your analysis plan is. They know question 7 is where all your exclusion rules are. So everything becomes just super easy with the use of as predicted. And we've been really big on this because if you look at clinical trials or maybe some other websites on pre-registrations, literally we've seen some pre-registrations that are 100 pages long. And many of them are like 10 single space pages. You don't know what to look for, where to look for it. And so like, who's going to evaluate that? Whereas a 1 to 2 page PDF is pretty easy to evaluate. So that's why we are like very religious about like these things should be short. They only need certain pieces of information in order to really validate that you aren't p-hacking your analysis. And we think that's the main point.
My name is Colby. I'm a postdoc at IU Bloomington. And so I work in nutrition and obesity. So I just wanted to...
support from the highest levels, for
Yes.
FYI. Yeah.
Yeah.
As I'm sure you know.
I just wanted to express, just build off this conversation, frustration with journals not enforcing, retrospective registration. So when people, often I see journals with policies that require registration, but then I'll go back and look at the registration, and it's pretty clear that the authors registered it just before submitting their paper, and that's not the point of pre-registration. And just for an example, we submitted a letter to the editor earlier this year critiquing a study for a statistical issue. The journal's policies, said that they required data sharing and prospective pre-registration. This paper had neither of those. We included that in our letter to the editor that, if they had enforced this and if this paper had that, then we would have been able to check if this was a concern, if this was if it changed the results of the paper. And the journal came back and said, basically, we can't put that in the letter because we can't enforce this on all of the papers. They're not enforcing it, and we couldn't point it out that they're not enforcing it. So I guess how do we put pressure on, besides being, through peer review, how can we put more pressure on journals to actually enforce their own policies?
Is the camera still on? Yeah. I don't have a quick, easy answer for you. Doing what you're doing, but it takes a lot of time and effort. Support from a dean who's super active in this space to say like, yeah, this is worth doing. It can rub folks the wrong way in your discipline, which is particularly scary if you're a pre-tenure or permanent position. But I could think of a bunch of ways. I don't know how good they are. I think science needs to slow down a little bit. There's talks about, metaphorically burning journals to the ground, and just if we started science now, would we have journals at least as they exist today, or would it be more of a kind of software development model? Again, I don't know where I'd land on that, but these are just some things that are out there. But in terms of working within existing structures, a lot of it has been this auditing from those in the area who really care, forming trusted relationships with those on editorial boards who can make decisions, joining editorial boards, or you're starting your own journal with those in the area who care and spending the time to enforce them. Just want to, as you know from writing this, it is important to recognize like doing that auditing takes time. And then if you're an editor or a peer reviewer, it takes a lot of time. We have a lot of competing demands. So doing things like that, having that be recognized is another thing that comes up a lot in conversation. There's a National Academies group right now that's about realigning incentives in the scientific ecosystem, particularly at universities in the US, to value things more than just publishing a paper and getting a grant. Something like everything needs to happen. Wherever you can do something, do it, and we've got a support network here. But happy to chat more concretely for your particular area, for the particular journals that you want to change.
My name is Ingrid. I'm from Mexico, and I work in a civil society organization. And we do research, and we don't follow these things. And it's very hard for us to take that because we have like very different timings, and because from the beginning, the research we do, it's like supposed to help to do advocacy and lobbying, and we don't publish in journals. So that's not like an incentive for think tanks or civil society organizations, but we definitely should be adopting these tools because we are related to public policy. So I would like to ask if someone here has experience pushing these things in this context in international development cooperation research, and that's it.
I would suggest talking to Fernando. Not necessarily international development cooperation research, but he'll talk on Friday about open policy analysis. So it's a kind of a different kind of research, but maybe a faster kind of research. And I guess something I've also been thinking about is how open data and intermediate research outputs can be shared before something is published. So if you're never going to publish something in a journal, can you share outputs in a different way? That might be, I don't know, a helpful way to think about the timeline.
Fernando, do you want to take a bow so people know who you are? But corner him during a coffee break and actually get something out of him before then so he doesn't go out the back door. I haven't worked in an international development firm, but I've worked in contract-based research organization. And I think I don't ever want my optimism, if I still have optimism after living in the UK for 4 years, I don't know if that still comes out or not, but to betray that these things are hard, they're daily, it takes a lot of work, but I still think it's worth it. So all that being said, where I've found the most success as I develop a coalition of people at my institution who care, and particularly different stakeholders. So, I mean, think about other people at your organization who don't have your role who might have an interest in this, is not making the argument from a Mertonian norms perspective, but what are the things that that group cares the most about, and then saying how this is going to save them time and money or achieve those goals, right? So a big thing in a soft money environment is funding. Hey, so like X share of the funders in this space for this unit are starting to require open data or trial registration. So like maybe we want to get the jump on developing policies and procedures in our review processes, both for proposals and then ongoing quality assurance, that add these practices to the checklist of things that we're doing. Some places have had fairly public instances of errors in data encoding and results that have led to these kind of oh shit moments. We need to put some practices in place where we are checking the code and the analyses that they're reproducible and mistakes haven't been made. That's a scarier change to make because now you're calling out something or someone for a behavior. So that's why like that is an approach, but it's a scary one and either requires really thick skin or a good job security or a great supportive boss. But I would encourage to think about from the perspectives of those whose behaviors you want to change, what outcomes do they care about, and can you reverse engineer the open science argument to their metrics?